Hi and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've visited before. I've received a lot of positive feedback from this little gouache painting that you see here, so I decided that I would share with you the process of how I went about painting it. I actually painted this in plein air. I visited this beautiful park called Lilacia Park in Lombard, Illinois. I've been going there for the last couple of years in search of lilacs, and as you can see, I did not paint lilacs. This little scene right here really captured my attention. All of the wonderful light coming from the left side, and just the shapes of and the lines of the vertical flowers and the tree trunk really caught my eye. I started off with a simple pencil sketch with just a color pencil that I had in my backpack. And as you can tell, I was sitting on the grass. I kept it very simple. I took a backpack and I had a little camping pad that you put on the ground so you keep yourself dry while you're sitting there. And I am using my gouache paints, a combination of Holbein and Winsor & Newton. And as you can tell, my palette's super messy, so I won't even go into the colors that I used. But I'm starting off with yellow ochre base right here. Very nice, thin, watery wash. And that is so that I could achieve a nice little glow by letting some of that show through later on in the painting. I slowly build up the thickness of my paint, which also builds up the opacity. So I am blocking in a bit of my sky right now with a mixture of just white, ultramarine blue, and I have a tiny, tiny bit of alizarin crimson in there just to make it a tiny bit more on the purpley side. But it was a very, very bright sky. The sun was starting to set, so it was washing out a lot of things. You would think that there would be more color in it, but it really wasn't. It was very bright, and I was trying to capture that with my sky here. Now I'm working on my lid of my paint palette to mix my colors, because as you could tell, my paint palette is really messy right now. I need to clean it out. And I was trying to find the right color to put in as a base color for some of the lighter, brighter greens. I don't have a set method for how I start all the time. Sometimes I start with my darks. Sometimes I start with my really bright colors so that I make sure that I don't cover them up, because I'm usually thinking ahead in my process, and I try to save myself time whenever I can and not have to cover things up that could work for me right from the beginning. So here I'm just working a little bit around that tree trunk, again, because I don't want to be fighting with paint layers that are underneath if I haven't decided what colors I'm going to put in there yet. And I'm just pretty much sticking to a nice little base layer for the tree trunk. And I'm keeping it very thin right now, because I will be building up my layers as I build up texture and create the bark effect in the tree. So this is just kind of like a little bit of a cooler gray color that I'm adding on there. And I'm just trying to make sure that I show a little bit of the texture of the bark along the edges of the tree trunk. So try not to go like too straight. And I'm making sure my bristles on my brush are a little bit splayed so that I get a tiny bit of those brush marks in the tree, and you could see a little bit of those vertical lines as I'm moving up and down. Now here I decided to go back to my grass and also to the sky. I wanted to indicate where the sunlight was coming from, and it was a really good spot for seeing my subject, but it wasn't a really good spot for me to sit and to paint, because every time I looked up, the sun was directly in my eyes. So it was to the left here, and I wanted to make sure that I showed a little bit of that sun glow up in the sky. I am still keeping my paint layers a tiny bit thin, not too much water, so I don't want them watery, but I am keeping them a bit thin as I'm blocking in some of my some of my darker areas and in the ground so that I could have a good base layer for any mid values and highlights that I add in later. Now here I am blocking in some of the base layer for the ground and the dirt that will be underneath all of my plants and flowers and foliage that I'll be adding later. And I am also adding in some thicker textures of a more purpley color for the tree trunk. I like to add blues and purples in my trees. I feel like it adds a little bit more interest than just keeping them just brown. I find that a little bit boring actually. So I'm going over and adding in some of the brown in there, but I'm still trying to let some of the purple show through. Now I am coming back into my bushes and making sure I get in those nice big shapes of mid values for my greens underneath. And I will be coming back over this to make more highlights later, but I just like to keep a nice bright vivid color in the beginning so that I remind myself that that's what will be happening in those areas. And then I also decided to block in some more darks in the ground, and I'm using a lot of the same colors I've already pre-mixed every time almost that I am coming back in. Unless I'm using like a super bright light color, then I keep that pure, but a lot of times I'm mixing in the colors that are already on my palette, and that just helps keep everything simple in the painting process and in the mixing process, but also creates a nice cohesive effect in your paintings because you have a bit of the same colors in almost everything that is in your scene. Here, as you can tell, I picked up much darker, thicker paint, and I am using the edge of my brush to create more of the bark in the tree. This is actually one of my favorite parts when I'm doing trees, is getting some of that bark texture in there, and also re-establishing some of the dark in the bottom half of the tree. The entire tree is in shadow because the light's it's coming from the left, but it's coming from behind the tree. So from where I was sitting, the tree looked much darker than most of everything else. And of course, like the bottom of the ground underneath the plants. So I'm just trying to make sure that I show that dark value in the tree, especially toward the bottom as it sits closer to all of the plants that surround it later. Those create a shadow effect as well. And now I'm mixing a much darker, more muted green so that I can get that into some of the little masses of plants that I'll be adding in the ground. Now I am mixing up a nice dark muted green to mass in some of the big shapes that are in the bushes in the background, and just using the corner of my brush for some of the areas to indicate some of the shapes of the foliage around the edges of the bush. And I'm doing this throughout my painting because there's also bushes toward the left, but I'm also coming back in and adding a few of the highlights that I see on the tops of those bushes from the sunlight that's coming from the left. And I also wanted to get in a few of the sky holes in between those bushes. I've been trying lately to really observe what all of the greens in all of the foliage and nature outside really look like, because there's a lot of variety in there, and so I'm trying to make sure that I add in a variety of greens to make it look a little bit more realistic. Even though I don't paint realistically, I also don't want it to look too illustrative or just kind of like cartoony. So I try to really pay attention to that, and I have to do a lot of back and forth to reestablish darks or lights as I'm working with gouache, because I usually tend to cover some of it up. And I think that's part of just the process of working with gouache is you do have to make adjustments constantly and really go back and forth with your color mixing and with your layering. I'm also trying to keep my greens a little bit more muted, those especially that are not in the direct sunlight and are not as bright. And I'm putting in some of those greens in the smaller areas on the left of bushes. And if you notice, I'm going to be going back to the ground, but before I do that, I go back into that original mixture that I was using for my dark greens, and I just add to that to create a new color to introduce to the ground, because there's also some variety of colors in the soil, and that will also add a lot of interest as it peeks through in some of the plants that I'll be adding later. I am creating a nice little dark base for some little just small little shapes that are in the foreground of different plants. And if you see my brush just kind of hover over my painting, that's usually just me trying to plan things out and thinking about my next step. Now here I am coming back in with an even thicker layer of some of the base color for the darks that will be behind and underneath my plants that I will be adding here later, and some of the foliage for the flowers that are going to be pretty much my last step in the painting. I am adding a little bit more of a dappled light to the left of some of these grasses and plants here on the bottom. And I got a little bit ahead of myself doing that. I know I ended up covering that up later, but I felt like I kept seeing this and I kept wanting to put down some marks to remind myself. I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget my reason for sitting in this spot and torturing my eyes with all of that sunlight. And of course, it was hitting me the whole time, but it wasn't like directly on me unless I looked up. But my main focus for this painting was to really capture a lot of the light that I saw in the entire scene. It just added so much just so much beauty to it, and I had lost that in the path. So if you notice here, I'm adding the path color again, because although you couldn't quite see it in the video I showed in the beginning of the scene where I was sitting, my eyes could capture a sliver of the path that was behind the tree, and it was certainly capturing a lot of the sunlight. The left side of the tree, just kind of like the edge of it, was also catching a little bit of light, and that's what you see me adding here to the left of the tree trunk. I wanted to take a few seconds just to show you all my setup outside. When I was recording, I forgot to bring my bigger tripod to hold my camera, so I was using a tiny little tripod that could only angle my phone to a certain degree, so that's why you had that very up close angled view of my painting. So here I am making sure that I add in some of the little darks in the grass that is alongside the path. That whole area is actually a little bit backlit. So in order to show the backlit effect, I needed to make sure that I had some of the darks underneath and in the foreground, and making sure that I get some of those beautiful bright greens that are in all of the foliage around all of those bushes is also really important. So that's what I'm doing right here. And now for some very, very dark textures in the tree bark and a little bit on the bottom to give this tree a bit more of that cylinder form that it has. Right now everything is pretty much all the same, so I needed another little pass of some of my dark colors to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. coming back in with some pops of light into some of those bushes at the top that I added at the in the previous stage. And if you notice, I use my brush in a lot of different angles. I pretty much stuck to this flat brush for the majority of the painting, and it's really a good exercise to do. I've been encouraged to do it by lots of different art instructors that I've taken classes with, and it's something that really helps, especially when you're outside, not to have to be switching brushes all of the time, and knowing that you can create all of these different brush marks with just one brush, as long as you know, turn it a certain way, angle it a certain way, apply a certain amount of pressure. I encourage you to play around with your brush strokes. And now it's time to add in a few really dark darks underneath some of my plants and grasses in the foreground. They got a little bit too cool, so I'm warming them up with a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. I don't want things to get too cool, especially as they come a little bit closer to me here in the foreground. And I'm getting a little bit more of that dark all over, and just losing some of the edges of those dark marks that I made. That's the cool thing about gouache. You can really get rid of some of those hard edges very easily, no matter what stage of the painting you're in. I'm adding some little more sky holes in between all of my bushes. I find this so satisfying. There's something about a lot of the paintings that I love that show this effect that I really like that, when you have a little bit of the sky poking through in between trees or bushes or plants. That just adds a lot of interest, and you're able to carve out some really interesting shapes in your foliage that way. I'm reestablishing that little rim light that's on the left side of my tree trunk with that same sky color that I was using. I'm also bringing a tiny bit of that light here and there into the bark, just to add a little bit more of that 3D effect. And now I am going into the ground with a few horizontal lighter marks to add a little bit of that sunlight that was poking through in parts of the soil. I could see some of that from where I was sitting, so I wanted to make sure I captured a little bit of that. And I'm also going back into my path because I kept losing the brightness of it. I really wanted to be able to add a little bit more of my like bright, cool lemon yellow in that path, but something that happened to me is I forgot to bring my tube of yellow paints, and my paint palette had just a tiny little bit in there that I used in the beginning of my painting. So throughout most of the painting, I was struggling with some of the colors that required that yellow because I didn't have it with me. I had a million other colors, but I didn't have the one I needed, which happens all the time. I think I have a set of my primaries in every bag, and then I take them out for different reasons when I'm doing other projects, and then they never go back in the bag. So that's a lesson learned. Okay, now that I've added some of the little highlights back into my grass, I'm coming in with super thick paint because, as is the case with gouache, many times you have to go over certain sections, especially if you worked with a slightly diluted paint, because it will dry darker, and that's what happened in some of these areas that you see me coming back into. But right now, if you notice on my brush, you cannot see the bristles. They're completely covered because there's a really nice thick layer of that nice bright light color that I wanted to add for some of the highlights in the grass and in some of the plants on the left side, because that's where it's pretty much left, but a little bit behind the trees. That's where my light source is at. Coming back in with thicker paint, some little dabs with the corner of my brush in between the bushes, and this is where I switch to my small round brush because I'm adding in some of the final elements in my scene, which are my long, beautiful vertical stems for those purpley pink flowers that I'll be adding in later. I also use this brush for all of the grass and some of the variety of plants that I'll be adding in the foreground. Now, something that I was reminded of while I was working on these little stems is because I'm working with a very small brush, I needed to pick up much thicker paint, and whatever value I was using really needed to contrast with the background color, because since these are long stems, you need either a light behind them if they're a little bit darker, or you need a dark behind them if they are lighter. So I needed to actually adjust some of the stems and add both values to them and keep in mind where the light source was coming from. So that was a little bit challenging. It took a little bit more time to do that, but it was important that I did it. Otherwise, you wouldn't see any of those stems. And part of what really caught my attention in this scene were those really nice long vertical stems in the flowers. So here I decided that I would add a variety of plants in the foreground, so that everything wasn't the same. It wasn't all just like blades of grass. So you'll see me adding some plants with different types of leaves in them, or of varied sizes. This part took a little bit more time than I expected, but I actually didn't mind it. I don't normally spend a lot of time drawing small little details like this, because I tend to just stick to that big brush and do a lot of like quick brush marks. But finally got to my favorite part, next to the little sky holes, of course, and that is adding all of my flowers. I started with a kind of like a mid-tone base to add a variety of sizes of flowers depending on where they were positioned in the scene, and I added many more than what were actually in front of me. But one of my goals with the flowers was to really show the sunlight hitting them, especially the ones that were closer to the light on the behind the tree, and to the right of the tree. But I also wanted to give them a bit of dimension because they were closer to me and they were down in the ground at about my eye level or so. So I was using the tip of my round brush to create some of those little spiky effects. But then I also remembered that I had well, the color was a little too muted, so I brightened it up, and that's what I'm doing here, just brightening up those colors in the flowers. But I remembered that I had my Bristol fan brush with me. So I thought, well, it's kind of in the shape of the flower already. It's a little bit bigger than the flower. So I could use it if I just use the side of it. And so this is what you see me mixing into that beautiful flower color on my palette right now. That's my fan brush. And I don't use it that often, but I've been wanting to explore a little bit more with it. And so I think I've been using the side of it for like some vertical little grasses. But I want to use it like more thickly. So here I am using the side of the brush for some of those little kind of like spiky shapes on the edges of the flowers. And I'm coming back to my tiny little round brush and just reestablishing some darker shadows underneath some of the flowers, especially those that are in the foreground closer to me, because those had a tiny bit of sunlight on the rim, but not as much all around the flower. They were not catching as much light. The light was being blocked by the tree trunk. I am using my same little round brush and just blending in a little bit of that dark into the mid value of the flower. Again, I'm trying to get some of that form of the flower, and blending with your just your damp brush is something you can do at any point during the painting process, which is the beauty of gouache, that it can be reactivated. So just losing some of those harsh edges with the darks. I realized that a lot of my foliage and stems did not have enough dark in them, so I forgot to record that little snippet, but I did add a few pops of darks into those plants that are in the foreground. It was a beautiful, relaxing way to end my work day, just painting at the park, and I will be coming back here. I hope that you enjoyed watching this process and that you learned something, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing.